So is this an active congregation?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Really?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, I've been here before, yes. I haven't met the people that are going to be meeting us here, but...
That's true.
You know?
Yeah. Forget about those.
They're heavy.
I did not find any Kingsbury gravestones. As I remember, the lane is small. Eileen, oh come on! I gotta have a hug out of you. We've been communicating for so long. Yes, yes. This is our last day as far as touring is concerned.
Well, you have a beautiful day for today.
And we have one lady who was here. Well, who went from the outside. I'm not sure what I want to wait for. Foreign language is correcting my English everywhere we go. They're all very good.
Entryway, isn't it?
You're going to receive this, you get a copy. No,
Yes, I am. It's okay.
Right, well, shall we start? What I thought was, as it's a nice morning, we'll start off out here and just sort of have a look at the church itself and talk to you a little bit about that, and then we'll go inside afterwards. As Eileen will tell you, I can talk without interruption for hours and hours and hours. So if you've got any questions, just shout. So yeah, welcome here. It's very good to see you all here. We are a very small local history group. In fact, you see most of us here already. In the background there's Elizabeth, Eileen and Rosemary. It's myself and a couple of others. And essentially what we do is to track as much as we can of the history of this small parish. It is small, it's about 1,700 acres, most of which is farmland. It's about, at the moment, there's about 250 people live here. At its peak back in the 19th century there were about 400, but it's never really been very different from the way it is now. And as you've probably noticed coming in on the bus here, there's no real village centre as such. This isn't a sort of chocolate box village with the church and the village green and the pond. This is actually quite a common arrangement in East Anglia, because East Anglia is and always has been farming land, and what matters is the land, and the housing was put where they couldn't farm. So if you look at an aerial photograph of little Cornard, the housing is spread right the way around the outside on the marginal land. The only real house of any substance in the centre here is Peacock Hall next door to us here, which is where the Lord of the Manor lived for a number of centuries. We're not entirely sure, because the records are a bit fragmentary back then. We're not sure whether he built the church in his backyard or he decided to build his house in the church's backyard. But what it means is we have this fantastic rural location here. You know, you're never going to get disturbed by traffic noise here. But what we also have here is essentially the oldest building in the village. Now obviously the church has been the focus of the village for centuries, for about 1,000 years. But it also captures the history of the village, and that's something I want to just bring out as we have a look at it. Our first record of there being a church here, not this building, was in 1086 in Domesday Book, which was William the Conqueror's attempt to find out what lands he owned and what taxes were owed to him. And at that time, Little Cornard and Great Cornard just formed a single parish, and it was described that there were two churches here. This one and the one that is now Great Cornard Parish Church. There's a tremendous constancy to these things. You can look at records from that far back, certainly in the early medieval period, and you'll find things like fields, roads that are still present. If we look at the entry for Little Cornard Church, the lands that it owned, I mean, measurements of area have varied over the years, but they owned about 25 acres along with the church itself. And to this day, they still own about 25 acres. And these things have actually rolled right the way through. So almost certainly, although I can't prove it to you archaeologically, almost certainly the building that was the church in 1086 stood exactly where that one is now. It's a classic place for a church. It's high up. This is about the highest ground in the village. It also marks where the earliest settlements are. We have archaeological evidence of presence here in Neolithic times. We certainly have Roman and Iron Age presence. We have Saxon presence, and they're all around this end of the parish here. So almost certainly this is where the original church was. But it would have been a wooden building. If you look at the church there, you see that central section, the nave there. Ignore the tower, ignore the chancel, ignore the porch. It's just like a hall in the middle there. And almost certainly the Saxon church would have been something very similar to that, a thatched wooden building. Now, as I say, our records are a bit fragmentary for that period, but we next pop up in 1251 when somebody else decided they wanted to find out how much tax they were owed. And there were the Norwich diocese, who controlled all the churches in this area, wanted to see what each of the rectors actually owned. Because the rectors of the church in those days, they were not the people who stood in the church and held services. They would employ somebody to do that. The rectors actually owned the churches and the parishes as a financial transaction. They were generating income from the tithes, and therefore somebody might well have 3 or 4 parishes that they took the earnings from. So this was to ascertain just how much they were earning from these holdings so that they could pay the appropriate taxes. And at that time in 1251, this was this holding here was considered to be worth 6 marks, which the mark was a sort of a medieval version of the euro. It was a universal exchange rate that you could actually deal in marks when you were dealing with Germany or France or anywhere else, or their predecessors. It's worth about £4. Now you think, well, you know, I'd give £4 for that. But of course, in those days, the average person was perhaps paying a few pennies a year in rent. So by those standards, this was a substantial holding. 40 years later, we've got a similar document that says, no, this isn't worth 6 marks now, this is worth 12 marks. So somewhere at the end of the 13th century, the value of this church went up from 6 marks to 12 marks. They did something then. This wasn't inflation. What they almost certainly did was started building the same church. So it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly when churches are built. You know, you can point at things, I can say, yep, that tower is late 13th century or whatever. But we don't have the sort of the documentation that says, yeah, we're going to start to build this church next Monday morning. But almost certainly that central portion of the church was started in the middle of the 13th century. And if you look at it as a construction, you can see that it's crude. The building materials are flint, and if you dig a hole in any of the fields around here, you pull up flint. It's just a local stone. It would have been a bit of a nuisance for someone trying to plough their fields. So obviously you go over the fields, you put all the flints in a pile at the side, and those were used to build the church. The walls are almost certainly what's known as clunch, which is where you just get a mixture of any old stones and you mix it up with some mortar and you set it in a wood. So they're very thick and they just have these facing flints on the outside. The trouble with clunch is it's fine for a wall, but it's not very good at the edges. It tends to crumble. So what you'll see, if you look at the edges of this, there are rows of very thin bricks. Yeah. Now, this is interesting because if this church was built, say, in the 1270s, we weren't making bricks and tiles in Britain at that time. We had done in the past, but it went out of fashion and didn't really come back till about 150 years after that. So you think, well, where did those come from? And in fact, when you look at them, they are also second-hand used bricks and tiles, and they're Roman. And these too would have been picked up in the field. And we've got some examples in the church you can have a look at in a while. But there was a Roman farm just over there. One of the members of our group has been excavating there for about 10 years now. And he's not only found many examples of these tiles, he's actually found the kiln where they were made. So we have a pretty clear idea that those specific tiles were made in a field kiln about 200 yards over there. And if you walk over that field to this day, you will find bits and pieces of Roman tile after it's been ploughed. So this is exactly the same. And that's because this was built by the people who lived here. You know, Little Cornard was never owned by one of the grand families. You know, you're in Lavenham at the moment. Ordinary church, that's almost cathedral-like. There's similar ones nearby over in Long Melford. I mean, even Boxford Church, where you were yesterday, you know, that's quite a grand church because these were built by wealthy cloth merchants, and that was where the real wealth of this area came from. A little bit later than this, and looking at 15th century. But that wasn't the case here. This was a functional church that was built by the people who lived here.
And the oldest part of that church is the tower, built about the same time as this one, in the 14th century. But the sort of steep-roofed, thatched roof really defined a poor rural church. And those people had delusions of grandeur. You've seen all those fantastic houses they built. Well, they wanted their church to look grand as well. So actually knocked down the rest of the church. They left the tower standing, knocked the rest down, and rebuilt it in the trendy style. Whereas of course no one's ever done that here. So this is still pretty much as it probably was then. Now as we roll on forward, getting into the 14th century, the early 1300s were a difficult time in Britain. The 13th century, the climate had been good, there was lots of money to be made, population was growing, and then suddenly, at the beginning of the 14th century, weather was appalling. There were floods, there were droughts, the crops failed. In many parts of Britain there was famine, but we escaped it to a great degree here. And in the 1320s, there was a new lord came into the manor here. I know you were in St Albans a few days ago, weren't you? Well, that's where he came from as well. A chap called John Peacock. And he stayed over there, but he took on this manor and decided that we needed to expand the church a bit, make it a little bit grander. And so, using his money, and I've no doubt he twisted a few arms locally amongst the wealthier people, they built the chancel at the end here. And you can see that immediately this is a more substantial architectural historian, but I can tell you that is a classical decorated style which pinpoints it to the beginning of the 14th century. And we've got evidence from wills that have been left in the will from 1319 where somebody left a load of timber to allow the roof to be built. So we know that building was going on through that time. Now one thing that Little Cornard didn't escape was the Black Death. 1349, we have documents from 31st of March 1349, there was a manorial court held, and there were 6 people who had died. Now, it was... Don't get me onto that subject. Please don't.
Different period.
Exactly, yeah. The plague you're thinking of in London was about 300 years later, probably the same illness. But I'm a doctor by training, and I have a great interest in plagues. So I could be here all morning talking about the plague, but I won't.
The early one.
The early one, yeah, people. And what they did was they started building that tower. Now, okay, we look at that and think, yeah, okay, that's a nice little tower. It's not the tallest I've ever seen, but it's all right. You imagine you're a 14th century peasant. How are you going to go about building that thing? You know, you're not going to have a tower lift. You're not going to have steel scaffolding. You know, and yet they built them everywhere. You know, this isn't unusual. Every single village church of this sort of period, they were doing extraordinary things. And they built that, and they hung a bell in the top. The little cupola on the top is much later. That's from 1803. That was put up there. We know that because if you stand over in that corner and get a pair of binoculars, you can read the name of the vicar and the church warden from the days 1803. But yeah, they put this tower up because for them this church was the centre of their life, essentially. And at a similar time, a little bit later, they put this grand porch over it at the south door as well. 17th century. That's essentially, excepting the roof, essentially how this church would have looked in 1400. So it's been there almost unaltered. And there's nothing else that can do that. I mean, there's the odd building. We've got a 15th century cottage down there. There's a manor house over there that's got some timbers that are even older than 1176. But it's all been changed now. There were an awful lot of John Kingsburys. Between 1328 and about 1600, they all seem to have been called John. So it's very difficult to work out who was who. But certainly in 1328, this man, John Kingsbury, owned a certain amount of land in the parish. He wasn't a lord of the manor or anything. He was a villein. He owed homage to the actual lord of the manor, but nor was he a poverty-stricken peasant. And they carry on through, and we've got one here. These are the burial records from the 17th century. And I found one, yeah, there we go. 3 guesses what his name was. John Kingsbury. 1632. Buried the 17th day of February, 1632. Everything about this village is actually central, so you can't actually see it. So this is the most important place. Let's have a look inside.
Is there anything that I could get a hold of?
London expanded massively in the 18th century. The majority of the bricks came not from the little Cornard brickworks, which was very small, but one of the big ones over the sub brick. They used to take them down the River Stour on barges and just round into the Thames and up that way.
I was standing here with a glass of wine, and the vicar was actually sitting where you are. It felt very odd. I can get used to this. Captive audience. So, okay, here's the church. I mean, as you can see, it's a simple village church. Most of the windows, or all of the glass that you see, is relatively modern. Most of it comes from 18th, 19th century. This particular window is only the building as you see it. The structure is pretty much as it would have been when it was first built. This roof was renovated in the 1840s, so these timbers are not ancient, but the structure is exactly as it would have been built. It's classic 14th century. But in total, we have 1¼ tons of bells hanging up in that tower. Should you be worried about that? Rosemary's worried about it. Well, you're all right as long as they don't ring them. They last rang in, we think now, Rosemary assures me 1949 she heard one of them ringing, but they've certainly not rung in the last 40 or 50 years. And the reason for that is because, firstly, around 1975 told us, all the timber work that's holding them up there was absolutely rotten. Woodworm. And you get the feeling, reading between the lines from his report, that once he was up there, he just wanted to get down again. These were just hanging there. That woodwork was replaced as the basis of that report, but the view was that would the tower stand it? You know, imagine 1¼ tons of bells swinging around in different directions. You know, that's a hell of a strain on a structure that is getting on for several hundred years old. So the bells haven't rung since the late 1940s, and almost certainly never will again. It's simply not so. The tower is fine as it stands, and as long as they're just hanging there, then I think we can be fairly comfortable. But I don't know if any of you are a mountaineer, but if you go and have a look later, there's a trapdoor high up in the ceiling there, and that's how you get to the bells. I've been trying to get up there for 15 years since I moved here, and I haven't managed it yet. But of course, that tower wasn't there originally. Originally, the church, as I said, was this structure here. The font would have been much further forward, more or less opposite the door there. And on the other side, if you look at the plaster on the other side, the door frame, see, it's just been blocked up. This was normal, almost universal in medieval churches in Britain. You had a south door, so it could well have been where the vicar slept, but has now been pulled out. So I certainly wouldn't have wanted to sleep in here. You know, this place, with the heating not on, it can be pretty cold. We've got a nice heating system now, it's fine otherwise. But just there, it was probably quite a cosy little place to live. Yeah, I mean, the connection with the priories is quite interesting. So the priory down in Colchester and another one at Stoke by Clare, and they both had stakes in this church, and they both used to send people here. And in the Black Death in 1349, we know that there was a friar who used to take the services here. Not sure whether he was from Stoke or Colchester, but he sort of saw his flock through this dreadful time of the Black Death. And right at the end, just before it all finished, he died as well. And we have a record that they had to send a new vicar down here. Now, as I said at the beginning, I can drone on for hours. And I think I'm probably going to stop now. For me, the essence, this church defines the essence of a Suffolk village. You know, clearly, its religious significance is there. Clearly, this was the focal point of the spiritual life of the community, but it was also the centre of the secular life of the community. You know, this was built by the people who lived here. This was the place where which the village revolved around. And we've got one lovely piece of evidence to support that, in that we have a couple of burials recorded, there's no stone out there because this was before that, of a couple called Abraham and Sarah, who are listed as non-communicant, and were clearly Jewish, but they were buried here because this was the centre of their village, and that was acceptable because, you know, we have this image of the medieval church as being terribly intolerant, you know, and if you missed a church service, you got fined a shilling or whatever else. And yes, it's true, there were these rules. But in fact, they were much more flexible and tolerant, and there were many nonconformists at that time who were nonetheless part of the parish. They had their places of worship outside the church. You know, they could participate. There's a little window here that actually allowed them to look in on what was going on in the church, so they didn't actually have to come into the church. One could debate what that window is for, but that's certainly one of the possible uses for it. So this very much was, and to a great extent still is, the core of the village. And as a historian, it just tells the story for me. You know, that I can walk around this place, outside and in, and I can see the essence from Roman times right the way up to
and a brand new window there. It just describes the history of the village. And Kingsbury is a part of this. You know, I can't point to a gravestone and say, look, there's one of yours buried. But they're out there. And it's not just the one we've got the record of from 1632. There are dozens of them, most of them called John. But this place is the essence of a small village. And to be honest, okay, I'm focused on this because this was where I lived for many years, but you could do the same to any of the villages around here. You're going to Assington Church a little bit later on. There's another story to be told there. That was essentially rebuilt in the 19th century. You know, the story of the village is encapsulated in buildings like this, and we just have to learn to actually see it. There are many
Thank you, kind of like go back and do some more reading.
So I'll say that the window there. Yes. Oh, thank you, Laurie. You're great. But I sit there and I'm shouting at the screen. That'd be so stupid, you wouldn't do that. So I'm not allowed to watch them. These courts, they are, I mean, the court is a rather grand term. It's not a court like a court of law.
Towns are very close.
Sudbury's the biggest.